You, you know, y'all can stay out there and then come up in just a minute if you want. It's gonna be beautiful, huge. Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to the press room. Today we have a little bit of good news about supplemental reinvestment that we intend to do here in Louisiana. I've got Commissioner of Administration Jay Darden with me today, as well as Sean Wilson, Secretary of the Department of Transportation, and following my prepared comments, you may have questions that require them to come up and make some, hopefully not corrections, but additions to what I'm going to put out. Specifically today, we're going to talk about our plan to reinvest in critical priorities across the state of Louisiana using the nearly $122.6 million that's budget surplus from the fiscal year that ended June 30th of 2017. At the end of this press conference, we'll also briefly discuss our plan for approaching the investment of excess dollars that will be available to us in the current fiscal year. So these proposals will make up supplemental appropriations bill that we will file with the legislature today. It's been a while since we've been talking about surplus, so let's talk about what this means. These funds are considered one-time money that can only be used on one-time expenses and should only be used on one-time expenses. And in fact, because they are surplus dollars, the Constitution mandates where we can use these funds, and we are following those guidelines, and as such, we are proposing to use $30.7 million to go towards the rainy day fund. $12.2 million will go towards the unfunded accrued liability in our teachers and state employees pension programs. We will invest the rest in Louisiana's future through a range of projects excuse me, that will benefit every corner of the state, including transportation and infrastructure projects that await funding in our highway priority program, deferred maintenance on state and university buildings that have been woefully neglected as part of what now constitutes a $3 billion backlog of deferred maintenance needs, local projects currently in the capital outlay program, and support for local government. Specifically with respect to transportation and infrastructure, we intend to invest $40 million in 23 transportation projects, thank you, throughout the state. From North Louisiana to South Louisiana, we'll build and replace bridges that are crossed by more than 9,000 Louisianans every day. We will repair roads and ramps to improve traffic flow and safety, not only for our citizens, but commerce as it makes its way through Louisiana. All the projects that we are proposing to fund are in the highway transportation program today. So these needs have been identified by the state agency headed by Sean Wilson, but working with the legislature, with local government, with economic development organizations, and the public, all providing input into those projects that constitute the highway priority program. As mentioned before, every corner of the state will receive funding for these projects. And it should be noted that these projects are in addition to the more than 200 projects that total more than $690 million that will be in the highway priority program for next fiscal year. A complete list of these projects will be made available to you shortly. With respect to deferred maintenance, as I mentioned before, we currently have a $3 billion deferred maintenance backlog on state buildings and college campuses. I have seen firsthand the crumbling buildings, washed out roads and bridges, and moldy libraries at LSU, Grambling, Southern, and similar issues exist across the state of Louisiana on just about all of our campuses. Therefore, we're proposing to use $10.4 million to address the deteriorating infrastructure on our college campuses and other state buildings. This is simply an effort to protect state assets that have been neglected for too long. And we're not doing nearly enough, but it's important that we dedicate a substantial portion of the surplus so that we can take care of our most critical priorities. Because of the neglect that these buildings have faced for too long, our students are actually exposed to substandard and sometimes dangerous conditions. This is a problem that students and faculty and alumni and others have spoken about to me personally. While we can't afford to do everything we would like to do, we need to start chipping away at these needs of our university and community college campuses as well as state buildings. With respect to capital outlay program, if you look at this slide on the left, you can see that just as our operating budget was hitting the $2 billion deficit, the worst ever, we were actually at the all-time highs in our capital outlay program, especially as it relates to Priority 5, but you can see it was across the board in Priority 1 and Priority 2 as well. And so we've started to manage this program as soon as we came into office, and you can see the changes that we made to right-size the program. It's not easy, but it is essential because there is a definite linkage between our operating budget and our capital construction budget. With $6.7 million of the surplus, we will be working to clean out smaller projects from capital outlay. And using cash up front for these projects rather than a typical approach of bonding them out for 20 years, it is just more fiscally responsible way to fund these smaller projects. Using the traditional approach of bonding, the state would pay double and sometimes triple the cost of these smaller projects by the time you add up the debt that you have to service when you carry those bonds for 20 years. So in total, 199 projects were being funded with upfront cash that will improve water quality, invest in emergency preparedness, and meet many other needs as well. With respect to empowering local governments, the Local Government Assistance Program and the Community Water Enhancement Fund are critically important but have been difficult to fund under the resources constraints that we've had over the last couple of years. By designating $10 million to these programs from the surplus funds, we will help empower local governments with resources necessary to make critical investments in our rural communities. And I should point out this is $5 million to each, the LGAP and the Community Water Enhancement Fund. Among other things, these dollars are going to help jumpstart and improve infrastructure, sewer treatment plants, and water projects across the state of Louisiana. And real quickly, excess funds expected this fiscal year, according to the most recent announcement of REC on this issue, totals about $153 million. Now, that is the latest estimate. The largest portion of this proposal, should REC support this effort, will allow us to fix what is in fact a $94 million budget gimmick used by the previous administrations with respect to Children's Hospital. That gimmick in 2015 basically required the hospital to make advanced lease payments to the state one year that then created a budget hole in the following year. Those are practices of the past, but just one of the areas that we're now able, we believe, to right the ship. Meaning that we won't make this year's budget dependent on payments due the following year. If available, we also intend to use excess funds on the following. Right now, the state owes approximately $67 million to FEMA from old disasters that include the 2016 floods. Our plan would prepay what the state owes for fiscal years 2019 and 2020. That's approximately $46.3 million. Which will result in a savings to the state of about $100,000 by making those payments now. But this is also was incorporated into the executive budget plan for the state of Louisiana. And if we don't prepay these obligations, then we will have to plus up GOSEP's budget for next year beyond what's called for currently in order for them to make those payments next year. So we think it's a smart thing to do from excess funds. Further, as you will likely recall, my predecessor in 2015 met a mid-year deficit by kicking one of the 12 payments to the Medicaid providers so that only 11 payments were made in that fiscal year, leaving my administration to budget 13 payments in my first year. Well, the fact of the matter is we haven't yet retired that payment. So that payment's been hanging over our heads from the moment we took office. Because we are limited in how we can use surplus funds and considering all of our outstanding obligations, we intend to make a substantial payment toward that old debt using projected excess funds within the Medicaid program currently. And to help us do that, we do anticipate a surplus in the Medicaid program for the fiscal year. And the amount we will make in terms of the payment towards this 13th payment will depend largely on what that final surplus looks like. But we also intend, if possible, and depending upon the outcome of the REC meetings, to add excess dollars to that payment to retire as much of it as possible. Finally, you've heard us talk a lot about transparency in Louisiana in terms of how we meet our obligations and pay money to creditors and vendors and so forth. You've also heard us talk about an antiquated management system that needs to be modernized so we can better manage our state agencies and monitor what they're doing. So we are currently ranked number 7 in the country in the transparency as it relates to how we provide online access to information about government spending. Our goal is to make Louisiana number 1 in this category, and so we intend to use $30 million of projected general fund savings in the current year to bring our state agencies under uniform financial aid and budget management system. This is both a transparency and a management investment. So this should help us improve transparency across state government with the Louisiana Checkbook Initiative that you all heard so much about over the last several months. We also have judgments against the state of Louisiana. There are more than 140 judgments against the state that total more than $44 million, and they are accruing interest. But this does not include a significant large judgment that dates back to 1984 over in southern Tangipahoa Parish. However, the proposal that we're making would allocate $10 million of the current year's excess funds to retire some of those old judgments and prevent those judgments from continuing to accrue interest. In conclusion, we are making a substantial investment in our state by paying off owed debts, allocating funds to our priorities in a more fiscally responsible manner, and continuing to correct mistakes of the past. As it relates to the excess funds for the current year, there are some outstanding questions, but we will have a much better idea of where we are headed when REC meets, and I believe a meeting is being contemplated for the middle of April. Regardless, this is what we can accomplish when we budget responsibly, invest in our communities, and pay our bills. We can certainly make Louisiana a better state for all of us, even if we have to do it a little bit at a time. And while we're able to do this now, simply our state's economy is doing better. It is steadily improving. Jobs are being created. In fact, we're down to the lowest unemployment in 10 years, and the decline in unemployment in Louisiana over the past year is the second largest in the entire country. We're also seeing wages beginning to increase, and as you all have noticed, oil prices have risen and stabilized in the mid-60s. So that is certainly helpful. Of course, our ability to make investments like these in the next fiscal year is certainly in jeopardy so long as we don't resolve the fiscal cliff. If the legislature does not do as I've asked them to do, and that is replace most, not all, but most of the expiring short-term revenue that falls off the table on June 30th, then come July 1st, we're going to start our year off doing the exact opposite of what we just announced, and that is making strategic investments in our state. We can stay on this track, on the right track, and move Louisiana forward. I'm optimistic that we're actually going to be able to get that done. So with that, I'm going to take some water and some questions as well. Yes, ma'am.
So, just my rudimentary math, I'm assuming you're expecting the excess to grow for the current fiscal year based on what you're doing now?
Yeah, well, I think what I said was we have a lot of questions around current year excess, and we won't know the details until after REC meets. That's the way this would work. You know, for example, on the Children's Hospital Initiative, if we don't continue to receive advanced lease payments, then they would not count that revenue in the current year. And so but the REC has to meet to see what the current forecast is in terms of the excess in the current year, but also to make other decisions as we try to line up the payments coming in when the obligations are actually due, so that we don't stay with this advanced lease payment and create a budget hole in the following year that can only be met by a continuation of the gimmick. And so we're trying to put it to rest. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I doubt if you've actually read the bill, but he says that something like that is needed to restore trust with voters. Type of the stickers of the bill, what do you think of that concept? Because he wants to replace the secretary with the executive director, have 8 or 9 members.
Yeah, and I try not to comment extensively on bills before I've read them. I think he just filed the bill. It's a long bill. I've had meetings with my Secretary of Transportation, Sean Wilson, but others in the past to discuss the concept. I'm going to read the bill, and I'll have more to say in the future on it. At this point in time, suffice it to say that I am doubtful that I will determine that approach represents an improvement over what we're currently doing. And I have confidence in the Department of Transportation and Development, and I see them work every day under the leadership of Sean Wilson and the district administrators across the state. The problem in our transportation system isn't the way it's configured or managed. It's the fact that the resources that they have to work with are too limited, and they're based on a gas tax that is 30 years old, and simply the inflation factor that has eroded the purchasing power of that gas tax is such that they have 7.5 cents today to do what the state was doing with 16 cents 30 years ago. That is the biggest challenge that we have, but I am going to read the bill, and I intend to meet with Chairman Cortez to discuss it as well. Yes, sir.
Just in the Baton Rouge area, obviously this is not going to pay for a bridge, but what are some of the projects that you're all looking for in the WFD land, for example?
In the announcement today?
Yes.
Well, Sean, you've got the list. But, I mean, there are 23 across the state. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there are 23 projects across the state that will equate to about 60 miles of overlay, and we'll give you the exact list that you're going to have. A couple of the projects I know of in the Baton Rouge area has to do with a pumping station, and there's a stretch of overlay as well within the WAFB world in terms of what that coverage is. And there's 6 bridges that we're going to replace in the state as well. That moves about 9,000 people per day across the state, across those 6 bridges. We closed a bridge on yesterday, which was the 9th bridge, so that's a priority for us, but we also recognize that we have overlays all across the state, north, south, east, and west, and we've covered them all, and we'll have a full list of those 23 projects, and that's above and beyond the 200 projects that are going to go out the door in fiscal year 18-19, and that list, too, is much more robust in the footprint that you asked about. Yes, Mark. Overlay is a repaving. It's a blacktop. It's where you pull the asphalt that's there off, and you go back with another recycled 2% or 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch increase, depending on the nature or the depth of your milling process.
Now, just to underscore again, in terms of we've spoken about some road and bridge work locally, are there any buildings or structures that we're talking about? Because obviously over the years we've had concerns over conditions at LSU, some buildings at the state level as well.
DOTD doesn't do a lot of buildings. We do roads, so I'll invite the commissioner with the governor's approval to answer questions about buildings.
The deferred maintenance component of the explanation covers the buildings. That's the $10.4 million that's going to deal with college campuses and state buildings, and we'll have those projects will be identified in the bill as when they're introduced. So absolutely, they're going to be building improvements as well as part of this plan. And I would just add, just to put a fine point on this, when we presented the executive budget to the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget, we talked about the best of times and the worst of times, and this is kind of the manifestation of that. We're at a point where we've done well in the previous year and have a surplus that we can spend on one-time uses, And we have a projected excess this year that we can spend on one-time uses, and we need to make certain that the legislature resists the temptation to try and take this one-time money in the current year's excess and try and save part of the fiscal cliff, because that's not the intended purpose of one-time money. And we have steadfastly refused to use one-time money to balance a budget, and this supplemental bill evidences that continued policy.
Yes.
I guess what's the big pitch is get the public excited about these projects, and hopefully the legislature will follow suit?
Well, we believe the legislature ought to follow suit because these are the right things to do. But at the end of the day, we have surplus, we're going to have excess, and we have to have a plan to invest those dollars. The plans have to meet legal and constitutional muster, especially as it relates to the surplus that by Constitution directs some portion of that. And today you're hearing our plan for the investment of those dollars. And the other big picture here is we can continue down the road we are currently on, where the state is doing much better than we were a couple of years ago, where we actually are running surpluses and have excess because revenue is coming in ahead of forecast, because the job situation is improving, wages are improving, the economy is improving because of sound management in large part. We can continue down that road, but we need to adjust the cliff as well, and that's critically important. And so that's part of the message here today.
Are y'all gonna spell out in the supplemental bill each of the specific transportation projects, deferred maintenance projects, and capital outlay projects, so they know exactly which ones they're voting on?
Yeah, they will know. You all are going to have a list of the transportation projects here today. Typically, in these bills, you allocate a certain amount of money to the highway priority program because every one of these projects is part of the program now. But we're going to have that list. They probably won't be spelled out again in the bill. But we will have the other items that you mentioned actually in the bill.
I asked because there seems to be a lack of trust among the members, everybody, about whether or not they're gonna follow through on spending money the way that it's delineated. So that's why I was wondering if y'all are gonna delineate like which deferred maintenance projects, for example, in the bill.
Well, we have,
It's a lump sum.
yeah, in terms of deferred maintenance, that's always been a lump sum. And we, on college campuses, we allocate the money in accordance with the list of priorities that we get from regents. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you.